All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming bright and early on a Saturday morning. My name is Emiliano Di Cristofaro. I'm a professor just down the road at UCL. And I'm just going to give some very short opening remarks and tell you a little bit about today's agenda. If I can... Okay. So for those of you who were here today, yesterday as well, this is a bit repeated, but for those of you who are here for the first day, just a quick overview of what is TTO, what is this new conference. Overall, we really wanted to bring together people from academia, from industry, and non-profit organizations, and I hope this is reflected very well in our agenda. Obviously, we started with sort of a broad mission, and our main goal is really to bring together all these parties that are working toward automated approaches that can strengthen the truthfulness and the trustworthiness of online communications in all sort of forms and shapes. Obviously, this would not be possible without the support of our many sponsors, and which we thank greatly. All right, so today's agenda has essentially, you can see, 3 parts. So we'll start with an invited talk by Rasmus Nielsen. We have a coffee break, and we have a session on news and news credibility with a number of really exciting talks. As you can see, from Judy King, Jeremy Rapaz, Anjan Bells, and unfortunately, there's one correction to be made to the agenda. Rebecca couldn't make it last minute, sends her apologies, but we're very happy to have Arkit give a talk instead. And finally, last talk before lunch is by Martino. In the afternoon, we have a poster session and another session of presentations on stance and extremes with Kate Sturbird, Rob Proctor, and the panel, and sort of a Q&A discussion before the next break, and then we conclude with 3 more talks by Preslav Nakov, Tom Stafford, and Amy Sipit. And so we'll have some concluding remarks, and hopefully we can start thinking about next year's event. All right, so let's get started with today's presentation. So I'm really happy to introduce Rasmus, who's the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and he's also a professor at University of Oxford, professor of political communication. He was previously the director of research at the Reuters Institute and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press and Politics. So please join me in welcoming Rasmus. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here. Our mission at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is to explore the future of journalism worldwide and to try to connect practice and research. So we try to bring together journalists, editors, media executives, people who work in technology, people who work in policy, and people who work in research to try to address some of the big issues that face our information environments going forward. And obviously, one of the areas we try to engage in the area that all of you are very interested in as participants or organizers of this conference, the problems and concern issues of information, quality online, risks of misinformation, risk of disinformation, risks of malinformation, and how one can respond to it in ways that are based on principles, fundamental rights, but also on some form of research, ways in which we make sure we actually diagnose the problems we are trying to address, so we intervene in ways that may, in fact, address them, rather than just intervene on the basis of assertions and opinions and the like. So what I wanted to do this morning to see if I can make some contribution to our collective conversation today is to talk about user perspectives on problems of misinformation based on some research we've done at the Reuters Institute. This is a team effort, so there'll be various other people who've contributed to this, and I will tweet links to the underlying research for those of you who are interested in looking at the evidence beneath what I'll say today. The fundamental starting point really is this. And I could just say this and then walk out, and I would feel I had tried to sort of say my part. If we want to respond to problems of misinformation, we have to understand them. If we want to understand problems of misinformation, we have to understand how people understand misinformation. Human communication is majority non-literal, it's pragmatic, it's based on relations that we create with pieces of content or pieces of information we come across. The meaning is created in that relation. It's not intrinsic in the content itself on its own. And the majority of human communication is not about statements of fact. The main purpose of human communication is only in part to convey utterances that purport to represent a reality. It's also performative. We express ourselves, we create things through language. So the narrow focus, worthwhile and important, simply on veracity of literal statements is a very small subset of problems of misinformation and more widely information disorder. And if we want to understand how things are playing out in the wild, so to speak, we have to start from the point of view of the people who are engaging with that information, with that content, with that behavior, some of which will concern us, and understand their perspective. How do they get to it? What do they think of it? And who do they think on that basis should do something about it? So what might be legitimate from their point of view in terms of responses? Okay, so I'll run through some of our research to give you an overview of where we feel we are with addressing these issues, these fundamental questions of how do people come across this kind of information, what do they think of it, and who do they on that basis think should do something about it. First of all, the backdrop here, of course, is the move to what we call distributed discovery, so the end of a world in which people primarily get information about public affairs by going directly to publishers, in the old age through broadcast and print, in the dawn of the internet through websites, and a move to an environment of distributed discovery where people increasingly rely on various platform intermediaries as a way of accessing and finding news and information. So by now, in 2019, when we surveyed online news users in 39 markets across the world, we have by now a clear majority saying that their main way of coming across news online is various forms of platforms: search, social media, increasingly aggregators, and of course in some countries, messaging applications. And by now, 53% say that their main form of finding and accessing news online is some form of algorithmic selection: search, social media, and aggregators, whereas direct is less than a third. Now, contrary to what you are being told all the time in this sort of zombie idea that won't die, this does not, in fact, for most people, lead towards filter bubbles. To the contrary, far from creating filter bubbles, this reliance on distributed discovery is often exposing people to more sources of news than they seek out of their own volition. This is just a very simple breakdown. For those interested in more details, I'll tweet some of our research on this. But this is just a comparison of the average number of online sources of news used by people who say they do not rely on social media for news and those who do, and again, people who do not rely on search engines for news online and those who do. In both cases, we see automated serendipity, the algorithms behind these systems leading people to sources of news they don't seek out of their own volition. And in the case of social, of course, incidental exposure, where people are exposed to news that are shared by others in their network, others who are often kind of like them and often have kind of the same opinions, but are rarely only like them and rarely only have the same opinions. Now, this, in some ways, is broadly good news. More people get more news from more different sources online. Of course, there are many, many weaknesses that come with this move, many challenges that come. One being that overwhelmingly in distributed environments, brand attribution is a huge problem. People often don't remember who the provider of a piece of news that they got is. So here we look at a study we did here in the UK where we tracked people passively in terms of their behavior online. We looked at how they got to news stories, whether they came direct, whether they came via search, whether they came via social. And then within 24 hours of that, we surveyed them to ask them whether they remembered who the provider was of a news story that we knew for a fact they had read. Right? So we knew whether it was from the Daily Express or from the Guardian or from the BBC, and we asked them, can you remember what brand this came from, gave them options. Of those who go direct, 81% can correctly recall the brand within 24 hours, but people who come via search and social, accurate brand recall is much, much lower. So we have this sort of sense, if you will, of a erosion of the importance of brands in these environments and the more promiscuous consumption where people don't always recognize or even remember who the provider is behind news that they consume. More broadly, of course, this is in an even wider social context where we should remember that most people don't trust the news in the first place, right? So again, these are the top-line figures from our 2019 Digital News Report, just looking at the percentage of people who say they feel they can trust most news that they use. Just 49%, down 2 percentage points since last year. 49%, less than half of online news users feel they can trust the news that they use most of the time, okay? And in terms of the more generalized trust of news in general, it's just 42% who say they feel they can trust most news most of the time. And of course, again, the problems of trust are even more pronounced when we look to these more distributed environments. So contrary to the assumption in some quarters that people are sort of naive and just sort of willy-nilly consuming everything on trust, no, not at all. We have the opposite situation, really, a situation of generalized skepticism. When we move to search and social, people are far more skeptical, far more distrusting of the news that they come across than even the news that they come across from conventional publishers, even though, of course, much of this content often comes from the same sources, but just the experience of consuming them in distributed environments is associated with lower trust. Whether people are concerned about whether the things they see online is real or fake, there's a huge country differences here. In 2019, we asked the question in 39 countries about whether people are concerned about the news they come across online is real or fake. And we see very high levels of concern in some countries like the UK. 70% expressed this concern, up 12 percentage points since last year, in a situation with very polarized political discourse, lots of understandable and legitimate criticism of the platform companies, a lot of criticism of some individual politicians, some of whom hold rather high office now, about the veracity of some of the claims that they have authored, if you will. But also, of course, we need to remember that there are many countries in which this is not such a widespread concern. We have countries in Central Europe and Northern Europe, Germany, some of the Nordic countries, where it's about a third of the public who express this concern about whether the news they come across online is real or fake. But the question here is really what does it mean for them, if you will. And we did a set of focus groups in 4 countries a year and a half ago about what the term fake news is often used to describe these problems means for ordinary news users. And we asked them to define what this term means for them. I put satire up here first because this is the first thing people normally say, is to say, well, satire is sort of fake news, but it's not really, because you can sort of tell, right? So this is sort of often an example people bring up, but then they'll dismiss it. From there, things get much thornier, because the other most important example people bring up in the focus groups when we ask them to define what fake news means for them is what they see as poor journalism. Not false and fabricated content, not for-profit clickbaiting or political manipulation emanating from various countries to these. No, poor journalism, superficial, inaccurate, and sensationalist journalism. This is the number one example people give of what fake news is to them in the focus groups. Secondly, various forms of what people think of as propaganda, hyper-partisan content, whether these are politicians lying, extreme spin and PR, and this can be either sort of extremely opinionated columnists from publishers or, as said, politicians who really push an agenda. And again, I'm not saying I think this is fake news. I'm telling you this is what in focus groups ordinary citizens define as the meaning of the term fake news for them. Some forms of advertising, in particular the sort of around the web links at the bottom of many news articles, even from otherwise reputable publishers. A third example people offer of what they consider to be fake news. And only then, after these quite lengthy discussions of poor journalism, propaganda, and advertising, do we get to false news, which, like satire, is often dismissed in these focus group discussions, saying, well, that's not really news at all, so that's not fake news, right? It's something else. Whether it's for-profit fabrication or politically motivated fabrication or malicious hoaxes. So much of what a community like this is often concerned as sort of the primary locus of problems of misinformation and disinformation is not actually what the term fake news means to much of the public. From their point of view, the distinction between fake news and news is not a binary one, it's a difference of degree. It's a difference of degree and of gray shades between what's accepted as potentially controversial and sometimes perhaps sort of not quite accurate or complete, and then things that people see as examples of fake news, even if it comes from news organizations, from politicians, or from advertisers. So on this basis, we can start measuring, well, what are people's levels of concern over these different types? So last year we took the focus group findings and turned it into survey questions. And when we asked people what they say they're exposed to, 42% say they see examples of what they think of as poor journalism, mistakes, clickbait, and like every week. 39% complain about spin and agenda-filled news, and only 26% say they've been exposed to completely made-up news. Now, of course, the figure may be higher or lower, we don't know. We're just finding what people's impression are of the problems of misinformation as they experience them in their lives. And when we compare levels of exposure with levels of concern, we can say people are very concerned about political propaganda, even if they may not always feel they're exposed to it. They are very concerned over levels of sort of fabricated content, whether for political purposes or for-profit purposes. And they're very concerned about poor journalism. But the thing they say they're most exposed to is poor journalism. On that basis, it's not super surprising when we turn around and ask people who should do something about this, that the number one entity that people identify is the publishing industry. Right? If the problem is defined in terms of fake news, and people think that fake news, at least for them, primarily means poor journalism, it's not surprising that they primarily would point their finger at the publishers and say, you need to clean up your act. Now, of course, they also want the platforms to do something. Yes, a very large majority do this. And then the question of whether one wants to see some sort of government intervention, this is really different from different parts of the world. So overall, in 2018, when we surveyed on this, 61% say they want government to act. This is quite high in Asia Pacific, whereas in Europe it's about 60%, and in the US we have much lower levels, of just 41% who say that they want the government to step in and actually do something to address these issues of whether what you come across online is real or fake. Okay, so just quickly recapping the key points here, and then I look forward to any questions or comments or suggestions from anyone here. The move to distributed discovery has demonstrably expanded people's news diets, right? So in some ways this is quite good, and we have dismantled one of the sort of pervasive myths that continue to flourish in much sort of elite debate and policymaking debate, despite the dearth of evidence supporting it. But this creates new problems, if you will, which is that people often don't recognize the brands behind news that they consume online. They have low levels of trust in news overall, and they have especially low levels of news and trust in news in search and social, which increasingly are the main ways in which people get news online. And in many countries, we see very high levels of concern over whether the news people come across online is real or fake. 70% in this country of online news users say they're concerned about whether the content they come across online is real or fake. And these concerns, of course, are fanned by politicized use of the term fake news to attack the press systematically in some countries, and the wide attention to it by publishers who themselves, I think, sometimes contribute to this discussion, that draw on these deep-seated and much broader concerns and much of the public has about the reliability, trustworthiness, credibility, and veracity, ultimately, of much of the information they come across, including from publishers. And finally, this is what leads many in the public to see publishers as responsible for many of the main forms of what they see as misinformation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. We have time for some questions.
Thank you very much. To me, one of the most surprising findings that you described was the mistrust on people's own preference of news providers. So it seems to me that newsreaders would say, I have full control over who I choose to provide me my news, and yet I still don't trust them. So so a follow-up question to that would be, is it that you have alternatives and yet you don't choose them, or there's nothing and you can't trust anything, even if you did have a choice?
Thanks for asking that question. This is something that keeps me up at night. I think the simplest way to summarize what our research suggests is that in most of the world we are facing a profound crisis of confidence between much of the public and much of the publishing industry and much of the journalistic profession, and that there are very large parts of the public who don't feel that the journalism that they have access to, even if there are a wide variety of different providers, that it does not serve them particularly effectively. They don't feel it's on their side. They don't feel it reflects their values or interests. They don't feel it helps them understand the world. Now, I would contest almost all of those statements in a personal capacity. I think we have some amazing journalism today. I think we have very diverse journalism. I think we have journalism that comes from many different points of view. But our evidence suggests that much of the public does not feel that to be the case.
Okay, there is, yes.
Yes, I'd like to, Walid Al-Sakaf from Sadatan University. I'd like to ask about your perspective on the new genre of independent newsrooms that are crowdsourced, similar to the Correspondent, for example, where they have actually taken a bit of an interesting leap of faith in considering that income from advertising and other interest groups may be one reason why trust is not, provided by the public or by the readers. So, do you see this as a trend? Do you see that this is threatening the old business model of newspapers or media, corporate media?
I mean, I think the broader frame here, and this is a sort of I sort of make my living telling people things they don't want to hear largely. The fundamental truth is this, as I see it. The business of news that we had in the 20th century was based on low choice for us as users, and as a consequence, high market power of publishers over advertisers, who thus funded journalism, not because they wanted to, but because that was the only way in which they could reach us, the audience. That world is gone. It's never coming back. And the question now is, what do sustainable models for professional independent journalism look like going forward? Some of those models will still be based on trying to reach a scale audience and monetize that through advertising. There are a number of strengths that come with that, including the ambition to try to reach very widely, have a very popular approach, reach lots of different people. There are also some limitations. The advertising market is extremely competitive, as Google and Facebook are very, very good at selling advertising, much better than most publishers, much cheaper, and quite dominant in that market. Other models are based on reader revenues, and you described the Correspondent, which is one of this sort of crop of European digital-born news organizations who've basically said, look, we're not going to even try to enter the advertising market. We're not going to even try to have a mass-scale audience. We will build not just our journalism, but also our business on the idea that everything we do should be worth paying for. Whether it's a subscription or a membership, it should be something that someone somewhere wants to support us to do. Now, I don't think they challenge the business models of other publishers, but I think they represent one of the ways in which publishing can go forward. And we see not just digital-born organizations do this, but also legacy brands like the Times or the FT or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and so on and so forth, also increasingly focusing on reader revenues. Again, that has some values. Working for your readers rather than your advertisers has some distinct advantages. It, of course, also has a limitation. The truth of the matter is that most people will not be willing to pay for news. So we will see information inequality increase if this becomes the dominant model of publishing.
More questions? There's one here.
Hi there, Sam Cunningham, CEO of Polymonitor. It's interesting what you were saying around how people describe fake news, and it's what the kind of propaganda that politicians put out. I mean, we track every politician in Europe, and there's 10,000 of them, and they tweet about 8 million times a year in 20 different languages. Do you think that the public even have an appreciation of what politicians say, let alone trying to keep up with what they've said and the veracity of what they've said? And I guess kind of how that distorts and misinforms what people think and what journalists are able to think and report on.
I guess my personal starting point and operating assumption is that no one wants to be lied to, no one wants to be fooled, and that at some level most people will also want to know whether politicians that they might support, lie all the time, that this is an important axis, if you will. But I would return to the sort of the slightly philosophical framing I offered at the outset, that language is performative and expressive as much as it's about the conveyance of a description of reality. And I think there is a sort of sometimes I think in discussion on fact-checking, those of us who can be a bit offended when politicians play fast and loose with the truth, loosely speaking or broadly speaking, I think sometimes may misunderstand that a lot of people are at least equally interested in whether a politician seems to be on their side, as to whether he or she is actually, strictly speaking, sticking to the straight and narrow path of truthfulness all the time. and sometimes picking fights with the establishment about whether you are telling the truth or not is a way of showing that you're a part of it, if you will. If there are any women who want to ask questions, that would be quite nice. We've had a lot of men, including myself now. I think there are several at the back. Thank you. Sorry to be interventionist.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering, this all is a bit of an adjustment reaction that we need from society. I'm a journalist myself, and I'm wondering what you think the collaborations maybe need to be, or what society needs to do for the public to get a better understanding of this larger ecosystem that now people find themselves in now, but at the same time, the sort of default is, oh, it's all journalism's fault, or the publishers need to fix it.
I mean, I think it's, in my personal view, clearly not all publishers' fault. But there are also things publishers can do. I think the question of why is it that only 49% of our respondents feel they can trust even the news they themselves use, I think the only people we can realistically expect to try to address that issue are journalists and publishers. No one else will address that. So that, I think, is on publishers to try to figure out how do we actually, reestablish, renew, and reinforce that relationship with the public. That's the basis of everything we do. But then there are many other things I think other actors should do. I think the fact that brand recognition is so low in distributed environments, that falls on the platforms, and they really ought to redesign their product so people are capable of telling what the provenance of information is. There have been some modest steps in this direction, but I think this is largely on the platforms, and we should keep pressure on them to ensure that they actually act on this. And I think the larger issue about the opacity of this environment, the fact that it's so incredibly hard for us as citizens, but also even for a room like this of professionals and researchers and experts to actually understand what goes on here, that opacity and the lack of data that enables that opacity, that is on policymakers to address. We need to have better access to information about what's actually going on in the media environment we all rely on, so we can make more informed decisions as a public, but also as policymakers about how we respond to these issues. That, I think, is on policymakers.
I think we have time for one last question. In the back?
There's one at the back there.
Someone in the back?
Yeah.
Over there? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. You did make a comment earlier about the fact that most people are not willing to pay for their news. I'm wondering if the most recent events is going to change that, and of course people need to pay for food and basics first, but among those who can afford it. And then if not, what else could help?
So I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of reader revenues as a part of the business of news. I think we'll see quite considerable growth in that area in the years going forward. But I think it's also important to be realistic about how far that growth is going to go. And I suppose if you look at a market for news, and if you start from the premise that right now we see the most competitive marketplace for attention we've ever seen in human history, it's a competitive marketplace. Secondly, we see that the marginal cost of serving one additional reader online is very close to zero. So competition plus a marginal cost of zero, that will mean there will always be a number of news providers, both for-profit, non-profit, and public service, who will provide news for free at the point of consumption, probably the majority for a long time to come. And then combine that with the fact that a lot of people don't think news is all that good. They don't trust it, they don't find it all that valuable, they don't think it speaks to them. If you look at that environment, I find it very hard to imagine that we in any foreseeable future will see a majority of the population actually paying for news. It's too competitive. There are too many actors who provide perfectly reasonable substitutes for free. A lot of people don't feel there is very much value here, if you will, and on that basis, it's only a relatively small minority of news lovers who are likely to be paying. That may be a quarter of the population, and that can be quite a good business. But it's, in my view, not going to be a majority anytime soon.
Great. Let's thank our speaker again for a great talk and a very exciting Q&A. So we have a 20-minute coffee break, and then we'll restart at 10:20. Thank you very much.
A news